Hello! Today we're going to be switching things up a bit and doing a short celebration video for having passed 1,500 subscribers for this channel. I'm going to be joined by Shadrach, everybody's favorite 6th century Babylonian, and this atheist guy who wears a hat. Wait, you don't know my name? Of course I do, maybe. So for this video we'll be doing a Q&A. Shadrach will be reading off the questions, so let's jump into it. Okay, Nikit Sponha asks, what is your favorite argument or piece of evidence for the existence of God? Also, are there any widely used arguments that you don't find convincing? Well, which argument is my favorite changes a lot, and it's usually ones that interest me rather than the most convincing ones. Right now, my favorite line of evidence for the existence of God is that we have no principled way to distinguish between what sorts of things could be metaphysically necessary without relying on intuition. But our intuitions shouldn't be reliable for such an endeavor unless God exists. I disagree, but I'll wait until you've made a video on that before raising my objections. Thanks. Now, there are actually quite a few popular arguments that I disagree with. For example, I think the standard moral argument is formulated in a way that makes it really hard to defend. I've considered starting a series criticizing theistic arguments which I think are flawed. Like, we theists have a ton of good arguments at our disposal. Let's not lump them together with the bad ones. Oh, Dante Jager asks, do you think all people will be saved? My answer is probably not. I think that universalism, the view that everyone will be saved eventually, needs to be seriously considered and not just hand-waved away. A biblical case can be made for it. But ultimately, my conclusion is that some people not being saved is the most biblical view. Wait, do I need to pronounce this guy's name? Here, I'll give it a go. Curses Swajkiech asks, could God have a morally sufficient reason to make you a non-believer? I think so. Maybe there's a really weird scenario where God could only get 2 individuals to become believers by letting me apostatize. That seems possible for all I know. To clarify though, God wouldn't make me an unbeliever. If I were to apostatize, he would allow me to make myself an unbeliever. Well, doesn't that concern you? Well, not really. It seems possible, but also very, very unlikely. Now, there's a lot to be said on whether or not Christians can lose their salvation, but I think that if it is possible to lose one's salvation, God's going to work against that outcome because his end goal is to maximize the number of people saved, and letting people apostatize would very rarely coincide with that goal. Well, the Uncensored Christian asks, what is your view on evolution, and do you affirm it? Do you believe in a historical Adam? This will be quite entertaining, because no matter what you answer, you will anger lots of people. Yep. Anyways, I do believe there was a historical Adam. Now, regarding evolution, I'd like to think that I'm open-minded towards both views, but I really can't bring myself to believe in evolution. Like, the case Michael Behe gives in Darwin's Black Box seems compelling to me. You can give examples of molecular machines and cells made up of, say, 30 proteins. To have evolved, such a machine would need to have come from a predecessor made of 29 proteins, which evolved from a predecessor made of 28 proteins, and so on. The molecular machines can't function if you remove any single one of those proteins, though, so it couldn't have evolved. What? That is such a simplistic argument! You obviously have not studied molecular biology in depth. I have not studied molecular biology in depth, but given what I have studied, I just personally can't bring myself to believe the evolutionary framework. If I were to buy into it, then that reasoning with the proteins and whatnot would give me a lot of cognitive dissonance, which I tend to avoid. Well, Giovanni Padilla Jr. asks, what are your thoughts on St. Thomas Aquinas and his 5 ways? No, I'm no expert in Aquinas or Thomistic metaphysics, so take all this with a grain of salt. First, philosophy progresses over the course of time as great thinkers change the shape of the intellectual landscape. Now, Aquinas was an example of one of those great thinkers. He arrived on the scene when Aristotelian metaphysics was really popular. Aquinas, being a genius, made a bunch of arguments that work really well from within the Aristotelian metaphysics, the 5 ways. However, as philosophy has progressed, Aristotelian metaphysics has become less popular, so if his arguments are going to work at all, they're going to need to be heavily updated. Oh, speaking of Aquinas, Marvelator asks, what are your thoughts on divine simplicity? For those of you who don't know, divine simplicity is the view that God's attributes are all identical to each other and the same as God himself. So God's omnipotence and omniscience are really somehow the same thing, and they're actually both the same thing as God. That's a weird view. Yeah, and there are a lot of arguments against it. Like how the changing contents of God's knowledge can cause problems if God is the same thing as his omniscience, but God himself doesn't change. What proponents of divine simplicity do to avoid these arguments is to take really counterintuitive positions on philosophical questions. I don't want to use strong language like convinced a lot, but I think it's safe to say that I'm pretty convinced that divine simplicity is false. There aren't a lot of positive reasons to believe it, and there's a whole stack of reasons to disbelieve it. Well, Flying Banana asks, why aren't you a Catholic? Have you looked into the biblical evidence for the papacy, or Mary being the new Eve? I'm not Catholic primarily because I think the Catholic view of justification is unbiblical. And actually, official Catholic dogma is that divine simplicity is true. So if I were to be Catholic, that would force me to accept incorrect theology. Now, I have looked into the biblical support for Catholicism, but what I've seen has been pretty unimpressive, to be frank. You're just making everyone annoyed in this video. Adrian Ortiz asks, what are your views on eschatology? Oh, like the second coming, the rapture and all that? A lot of questions surrounding that stuff, I don't know what to think. One opinion I do have, though, is that I personally don't think the rapture is an event which is distinct from the second coming. I also think that, biblically speaking, it could be any second of any day, so we always need to spend each day like it could be our last. You do realize that's a bit cliche, don't you? And you're wearing a hat on top of your hat. Touché. Well, Jason Push asks, for Newcombs Paradox, are you a one-boxer or a two-boxer? Ooh, that's a good question. Well, as a Molinist, I'm a solid one-boxer. Sorry, I'm in the dark. What's Newcombs Paradox? I should make a video on it. It's really interesting. Well, Daniel Apologetics asks, why are you so square? Because squares are awesome, Daniel, that's why. Hervey Schmervy asks, what's your favorite English Bible translation? Oh, the New English Translation, or the NET. You know how most Bible translations will have a footnote here or there? Well, the NET has a footnote on basically every other word, and some footnotes are essay length. It documents every nuance in the original language, every translation difficulty the translators faced, every disagreement between manuscripts, and the logic behind their eventual translation decisions. Another fun thing is that the NET, or net, is supposed to be a pun because it's designed for the internet. See, there are so many long footnotes that a print edition of the translation would be massive, and some pages would just be a single verse, and the rest of the space would just be filled with footnotes. I mean, that didn't stop me from getting a print edition, but still. HV stage? This person asks, how do I assure myself Christianity is true? Well, assuring yourself that a particular view is true is really easy. Humans aren't completely rational creatures, so if you just put yourself in an echo chamber full of a bunch of people who all believe the same things as you, then you will become very confident that your views are true. Now, this isn't the rational way to assure yourself. That involves rolling up your sleeves, evaluating what level of evidence that would be required to rationally believe that Christianity is true, and then seeing if Christianity has that level of evidence. The same goes for naturalists, Muslims, and any other worldview. It's usually quite difficult. Yeah, usually it's easier to just find yourself a nice, comfy echo chamber. Well, I think that's a good chunk of questions answered, so before ending off, I'd just like to thank everyone who has supported this channel by watching my videos and subscribing and so forth. I really appreciate it. Now that's the end of this video. Thanks for watching.